This event, Conversations on Compassion, is part of CCARE, which is the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, which is based in the Stanford Institute of Neuroinnovation and Translational Neurosciences. I did not pick that name, which is part of the medical school. We strive to explore the neuroscience of compassion and altruism, and we have educational programs, we have training programs, we have seminars, we have conferences, and we have events like this where we just have conversations with, frankly, people who I think are interesting and contribute to my own education and hopefully will enlighten you. Tonight's guest, Rick Hanson, is a world-renowned, well-respected person who is a neuropsychologist. He, if I recall correctly, graduated from UCLA. I was down the street at UC Irvine. He graduated summa cum laude. I didn't graduate, but and he got his PhD at, is it the Wright Institute in Berkeley? And then he's written really a wonderful book called Buddha's Brain. I don't know if many of you have read it, but he's also actually a practicing therapist, which we'll talk about some. And he is also a meditator and has great insights into how meditation and these types of practices affect the brain. So without further ado, did I cover most of it? Have a seat. So welcome, everyone. Basically what we do is we know what you do now, but I think for my own interest, I'm always interested in sort of the backstory of how you get to where you're at. And you know, oftentimes, I know actually on your website, you mentioned some of it, but how does, as I think you describe it, a loving, caring family, which is always a wonderful start, how though do you transition, if you will, to who you are today, and what were the drivers of that, and maybe you can just start there.
Yeah, fair way to start. And I want to start also by saying I'm so happy to be here. What an honor and what an opportunity to be here with all of you and at Stanford. I apologize for the fact that both of our young adult kids have gone to UC Berkeley. But other than that, I'm really happy to be here. Well, I've thought about that, and I've thought about, because it's true for me, and I've heard it also sometimes from other people, that the feeling deep down inside we have as a young child is often very important to us, and a feeling that there's a lot of unnecessary unhappiness. You can't put words to it, you know, when you're 3 years old or maybe even 9 years old, but you look out and you just see a fair amount of the construction of crankiness, in a sense, you know, needless bickering of various kinds. You look in your neighborhood, your street, your family, in good, fine families, but you just see a fair amount of that, let alone in families where things are really problematic. And then you look out as a wee bairn, as they say with my Scottish ancestors, up at the grown-ups, and you just shake your head in dismay like, what are you thinking, right? And then you look out at the world and you read some history and you really scratch your head as a kid. What are you thinking, right? So in a genuine way, I think that was actually the genesis for me, as well as I think it is for a lot of people, this longing to come home to this dimly sensed truth that it doesn't have to be this way. Without it being utopian and without us all, you know, going off to some commune in Oregon and, you know, do mushrooms all day long and the rest of that.
What's wrong with that?
It's hard to get 7 billion people into the state. We have a whole world to take care of. You know? So the question is then becomes, how do you do that? And you know, that's what has really motivated me. A genuine interest, as I think it's motivated you as well, and probably everybody in the room. How do we actually do that in realistic ways, 21st century, with the Stone Age brain, as it were, late stage capitalism and global warming, et cetera, et cetera? How do we actually nudge things so that there doesn't need to be so much unnecessary unhappiness? And that was genuinely the beginning for me.
So from that interest and insight when you were younger, how did the rest unfold?
Yeah. Well, first on the psychedelic thing, as someone who's totally done them, and and I've had both profoundly useful experiences as well as some miserable times. And I think, like a lot of powerful tools, you can hammer, you can build a doghouse or a birdhouse, what have you, you can also bonk someone on the head. So it's important to be careful with them. I thought Gurdjieff had a good line about them. He said they're like a telescope. They can show you what's possible, but then eventually you've got to walk there on your own. And I think, to quote a saying from Tibet, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation. There's a cyclical process where we try to, in one way or another, you know, as it were, fertilize the ground, make ourselves increasingly accident prone to grace, and then comes an illuminating experience, which then we have to backfill often and manage the infrastructure of to kind of wake down, as Samuel Bonder puts it. So, you know, that's a quick aside on that one.
Actually, though, maybe we can just take a little detour there. So maybe you can enlighten us with that aspect of what you've done, why you did it, and the insights you gathered at the time, and maybe talk about the backfilling aspect of it.
Well, I'll think about that a moment here. What I will say first is that one of the things you learn from doing that kind of thing, as well as, probably like a lot of people here, just a lot of other kinds of practices that were not pharmacologically assisted, right? And you start appreciating, wow, how plastic the mind is. You can really nudge it. You can, and for better or worse, you know, you can definitely nudge it for the worse. Hopefully we'll talk about it, you know, it's vulnerability really. The brain is very good at learning from bad experiences and bad at learning from good experiences, in a nutshell. What do you do about that, you know, in terms of the larger consideration about helping nudge the world to a realistically better place? But for myself, I did, you know, I went to UCLA, 1969 to 74, height of the human potential movement and the psychedelic movement. And out of that, I also started doing a lot of spiritual practices. I came upon the Eastern traditions at the tail end of UCLA. I had long hair and gold rimmed glasses and a wood flute, and I was meditating. It was very romantic.
And now that's when
didn't get me any girls though. I don't know why. It's never succeeded in that way. That was the point.
Exactly. Isn't that why we're here? No. I'm being facetious, of course. Castaneda was there then.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, and so, which in a way is to make a larger point too. My own encounter with contemplative practice was Eastern mainly, and Buddhist in particular. And still, when you read the shamanic traditions or the indigenous people's traditions, and I think language is important, so we're not, you know, being colonial, as it were, in our language, you know, they don't get the respect they deserve, I think, from the standpoint of contemplative practice. So I want to give a nod there to what you just said. One of the more powerful experiences of my life was being at the bottom of the Grand Canyon on Christmas Day, reading Tales of Power by Carlos Castaneda. It just took me way out, you know, without psychedelics too. So, yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that because we look at, I think you can consider yourself also a contemplative neuroscientist as well, but we look at the history of that inquiry, and oftentimes Western scientists come to these things with an arrogance without the appropriate humility of respecting these traditions that have been thousands of years old, and very intelligent people have spent, you know, decades of their lives in this, over a few thousand years, to explore this, if you will, neuroplasticity, or the ability to change your brain. And then it's like we come on it and say, oh, well, geez.
We have an MRI picture. We're experts now.
Exactly. And the same thing, though, I think, with the shamanic practices, where individuals have been using, and I'm not trying to take this off into a discussion of psychedelics necessarily, but
you seem to be trying.
Well, I have to give this talk, so I'm trying to get off. But no, I mean, I think it's the same thing. You know, these practices have developed over thousands of years and have been integral parts of these people's traditions, and have given them great insights into understanding themselves and the world. So I think it's a very similar thing where, you know, unfortunately there was this detour with the counterculture and psychedelics which stopped the investigations of this for a long time. But let's maybe we can switch now over to contemplative science. Would you say that that inquiry with psychedelics, though, also gave you some insights or perhaps propelled you a little further? Do you consider it a positive experience overall?
Well, in my own life history, psychedelics were a really very small part of it, honestly. And in terms of my own kind of healing from my issues as a kid, and also general growth or development, it genuinely played a fairly small role. The role it played, particular moments and passages, was actually quite helpful for me. And I think other people can sometimes talk about it in that way. The Buddha, as you probably know, has a metaphor of the raft, where if we want to get across a river of suffering, we build a vehicle that could get us to the other side, but once we get to the other side, right, we don't keep carrying it around on our heads. So if it gets you to the other side, then you need to cultivate what you've gotten to at that point. I'd say more generally, in terms of my own history, when I encountered contemplative practice like in 1974, the early 70s, the mid-70s, coincident with the explosion of the human potential movement and the application really of psychology into practice in all kinds of wild ways. For me, that was like the intersection of two circles. Very powerful, because if you could translate somehow between Freud and Jung and Skinner and Carl Rogers and Maslow and Karen Horney, et cetera, and connect that with what these contemplatives were saying, it was a very powerful intersection. And then roughly 15 or so years ago, enough knowledge started to become developed in the field of neuroscience, really, that it could become practically applicable. As you well know, neuroscience is a baby science compared to many of the other sciences. But that said, it knew a lot, and in the last 10, 20 years, it's learned an incredible amount. So now we have a third circle, and the intersection of those three, for me, has always been really a sweet spot. I'm a methods guy, applied, although I'm beginning to produce some research right now on this course I created on taking in the good, but I'm a consumer of a ton of research. I produce very little. But I'm very interested, I'm very interested in the applications. Because how do you apply the knowledge you're learning about fundamentally the single common organ that we're talking about, whether it's from a neuroscience perspective or a Western psychological perspective, or within a naturalist frame from a contemplative perspective? We're talking about the final common pathway of all the causes streaming through us to make this moment of consciousness. The 3 pounds of tofu between the ears, right? And if you could use skillful means informed by neuroscience and psychology and deeply informed by the contemplative model of the mind, you could then intervene in that system, that extraordinary system, the Enchanted Loom, right? And really use your mind to change your brain, to change your mind for the better. And that just struck me as we celebrate Christmas, not Hanukkah, but anyway, I was like, whoa, this is great. There's so much we could actually do.
Well, but it's interesting you point out that, and this is one of the discussions I've had with some of my colleagues, is what I think is trying to be learned is how do we open the door, and then once we open the door, what do we put there, in the sense of we know the experience that the CIA perhaps and the military have done in terms of, if you will, brainwashing, and I'm not trying to make this a political statement, but people are interested in this perhaps not for the most altruistic of reasons, yet we also know that these can be very powerful for good, as you alluded to. But yeah, how do we not, let's say, necessarily have to do 10,000 hours of compassion meditation, but how are there techniques in which we can learn or adopt, which can give us access to this incredible part of our brain, which allows us to have deep, profound happiness.
Right. That's the practical question, isn't it?
That's why you're here.
Yeah, I'm a methods guy, or as they say at the MIT Media Lab, demo or die. In other words, by trying to do something concretely, you really learn a lot. Well, 2 points on that. The first point is that, sort of as a frame, if you think about it, historically, whether it's people sitting around a campfire talking with each other, right, 50,000 years ago, or therapists working with people 90 years ago, or contemplatives around the world, one way or another, doing practices over thousands of years. people have well understood how to do mental intervention A to produce mental result C, right? Do this and you'll become more compassionate. Do this, you'll become more mindful. Do this and you can work through your neurosis in your Oedipal complex, right? In the last 5, 10, 20 years, especially the last 5 or 10, the dotted lines are getting increasingly clear how mental activity A works via the black box of the brain B to produce mental result C. Now, historically, whether it's people becoming enlightened or simply becoming less neurotic, mental interventions A work, right? You don't need an EEG or an MRI to do practices that lead to the end of suffering or move you really far along that path, right? That's where I think it's important to respect the fact that a lot of what the science is doing is telling us what we already knew, or demonstrating that it's possible and increasing motivation. That said, this goes to my next point, when you know more about what's going on in that black box, when you start understanding more what the circuits are, as it were, the tendencies or the neurotransmitter systems that undergird, that are the naturalist, materialist basis, because that's the frame in which we're talking here. We're bowing in the direction maybe of the transcendental outside the frame, and we're staying inside this frame. Well, in this frame then, when you know more, what those circuits are, what those tendencies are, what those levers are, those brakes and so forth, then you can use very targeted mental interventions and activities, and sometimes you can improve upon traditional methods. Or you can adapt traditional methods for neurological diversity, the actual range of temperaments people have, or how they've been shaped in ways that we understand by life experiences. And that interests me greatly, And to that end, then to sum up, one thing that has struck me in terms of what we're talking about is, as I said, what a bad learner the brain is for good experiences, and yet it is primarily pleasant, positive experiences that are the primary basis of building resources inside, whether it's a resource of compassion or mindfulness or willpower or resilience or speaking truth to power or speaking from your heart when the chips are down, whatever those resources are, those are primarily built, to the extent they're acquired rather than innate, they're primarily built through positive experiences of them. And yet the problem is the brain is very inefficient, generally speaking, at encoding positive experiences into neural structure. That's what learning is.
Well, and this gets back to our primitive or primate or Stone Age, I think, brain, as you talked about, because it's great at averting or avoiding.
Right. Rule 1 in the wild, eat lunch today, don't be lunch today, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. Definitely, first of all. Yeah, that's true. So that's what interests me, because I think a lot of traditional practices, and I've been a meditation teacher for quite a long time, and a lot of therapy, and I've been a therapist for a long time, and a lot of child rearing, and I've been a parent for a long time, so I'm talking about myself here, but a lot of traditional formal and informal attempts to help people grow psychologically in one way or another, whether it's to heal old pain or be less depressed or illuminate their mind. Those methods are highly inefficient, and a lot of the value of effortfully activated momentary positive states do not transfer and become installed as enduring neural traits. And how to increase the conversion rate of positive moments into lasting neural structure has interested me a lot.
In fact, I think this is almost, if you will, the reverse of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? We can encode these horrible events because it's associated with this primitive but very effective fear mechanism.
Exactly right.
Yet, how do we encode at the same depth or level these positive things, which, when you relive them, they're so positive that that's how you want to act. And I think that's one of the challenges. One of the things, and maybe you can comment on this, that I repeatedly say, hoping that some benefactor will come forth, is, if you will, and obviously we're a Center for Compassion, and I think that's a very extraordinarily important attribute if our species is to survive, this idea of a compassion gymnasium. As you point out, we know that when people repeat these experiences, it reinforces them. Yet the other thing you pointed out is, everyone is different, and they respond differently to different things. Is it possible, since you are a methods guy, and I'd like your thoughts on this, to create a custom-made psychological profiling that includes understanding what resonates with somebody, because once we know something resonates with them, then they're much more likely to adopt it.
Yeah.
Even to include music, if you will, in the context of what we know about exercises that increase one's compassion. Of course, part of this is a mindfulness practice. And then also perhaps what we know about what is used, if you will, within neuromarketing or gaming, such as competitiveness, comparing yourself to others. Is it possible to potentially create, or what do you think of this idea, to create this application, which, like a gymnasium exercise program, is customized for you? You can use it on the web or on a mobile device, whereby it uses these tools to strengthen these types of behaviors.
Yeah. You sound very methods-oriented yourself in a good way.
Well, you know, it's interesting because, as you point out with yourself, that you're very interested in Buddhism, and I don't know if you consider yourself a Buddhist.
Yeah, that's a fair
Okay.
word. I'm a theistic Buddhist, a Buddha who has a sense of the transcendental, who's taken psychedelics. What else do you want to know?
And who graduated from UCLA. Well, but the reason I say that is it's interesting because within the framework of what we do, you know, I'm surrounded with people, not necessarily the psychedelics part, but who have a very strong interest in Eastern practices and Buddhism. And I make statements such as, you know, I don't care where this practice comes from, because what I'm interested in is the result. And so I'll make a statement like, look, if it comes from Scientology or the Book of Mormon, that's great. You know, all we need to do is to strip off, you know, the baggage that is put on it associated with human beings and their own motivations, and then find the method. And sometimes I get these raised eyebrows. Oh my God, what's he saying? But that's really how I look at it. I'm interested in the end point, how we get there, if it serves that purpose. And in some ways, it may be many roads to potentially one end, and I think there are probably many. And then in some ways, this gets back to this idea of this customized program for somebody.
Wow, there's a lot there, right? So just to go back to mental intervention A, or mental activity A leads to good mental result, mental benefit C. We've known, of course, that people can cultivate warm-heartedness, right, in all kinds of ways. So it's got to work somehow. And therefore, in the naturalist, materialist frame, it has to work somehow via the black box B of the brain. We don't understand that very well yet, but it must work through that vehicle in some way as a general framework. Well, I'll tell you a few things very practically for me. One is, when people understand and kind of appreciate more the negativity bias of the brain, you know, as you know, I call it Velcro for the bad, but Velcro for the bad, but Teflon for the good. There we are. It brings self-compassion in. I've had a number of people say to me, you know, I'm so glad I realized that, because I always thought I was a negative person because I'm a bad person. But I just realized, no, that's how I am. And that's also how my brain gradually sensitized itself to be over my own personal history. So it's like when you kind of appreciate that, that's a doorway into compassion, I think, for yourself. And it also makes you realize that you're more fragile and frail. There's a kind of conceit in the West, I think, where we want to be invulnerable, you know, and all the rest of that. And to really appreciate that you are vulnerable, you are frail, including that you have a frail brain that's very vulnerable to being molded in negative directions by negative experiences, that can cause you to be more of a steward, if you will, of your own brain, and out of care and kindness for yourself, much as you would be a good steward of your friend's brain if you had the ability to do that. You know, the person you have the greatest moral duty to is the one you have the most power over. Well, who's the one being you have the most power over? It's your future self, it's yourself. So anyway, that's point one. Point two, the thing that I've seen a lot around compassion training is, to begin with, you've got to get on your own side. And that's presumed, but it's not actually present for a lot of people. They're not on their own side. They're not for themselves initially. And so the learning doesn't really land, it kind of skitters off. So that first step of getting on your own side is important. And one of the ways I think to accomplish that, because that's something I've bumped into a lot as a teacher and a therapist, is to start by being able to access a felt sense of being cared about by others. Because the studies show when you feel more cared about by others, that helps you become more caring in general, and then apply that caringness to yourself. So there's that. And then the third thing I would just say is that there is growing technology on implicit learning, emotional learning. That's my territory of taking in the good. I'm very interested in that, and I've created a lot about that, as you may know. And so for me, there are ways, when you're activating these mental states, to not waste them, not let them flow through your brain like water through a sieve, but now that you've activated a sense of compassion or kindness towards someone, or compassion for yourself, or related feelings, you know, like joy at the good fortune of others, right? Or
That's hard at Stanford, actually.
I don't know. Well, it's a great undoing if you're afflicted with envy, joy at the good fortune of others. I was on retreat one time, because I do have envy, and I just did a meditation practice where I repeatedly said about someone who was my rival, who was unfairly ahead of me, and if the world only knew, you know, one of those, right?
Nobody in this room is
okay, good. I kept saying again and again in my mind, out of kindness to myself, because I knew I was the guy who was carrying around this monkey on my back, you know? I said, may you have all the success that I don't. I went for it, and that was very freeing for me personally. So to sum up, there are ways, if you activate these states, to skillfully install them in your brain. And what's great about these ways is they're enjoyable, you know, and they're short, like 10 seconds, 20 seconds to stay with the positive experience. You're going to get those neurons firing together so they wire together, and that's how you weave it into your brain. And so for me, it's a practical matter to go to your gym. I love your gym idea, you know, is to make sure that when people activate these states of mind, because that's the doorway to installation, that they relish them, that they stay with them. I call it enriching and absorbing, so that they really sink in. And then that increases the conversion rate, which is the learning curve of turning positive moments into a great brain. So.
No, I agree with you. And you know, it's interesting you point out one of the things I often talk about, and maybe I stole it from you, is, you know, we spend so much psychic energy trying to give this impression that we're not vulnerable or fragile, and therefore we have a lack of vulnerability. But the thing that results in connection is vulnerability, right? I mean, and it's interesting because, and some who've attended this periodically see me get tearful or well up.
They warned me about this.
Yeah.
They said the clinics is for you.
Yeah, exactly. No, last week it was for someone else.
Try to make them cry.
Well, I'm pretty good at it usually. But it's okay. It's okay. But when you do that, people embrace you almost universally, because that's what people want to do. If you show that you need caring, the natural inclination is to care. And it's so unfortunate that people don't generally feel that it's okay to show your emotions, to cry, to engage, because people love to care for another person when they see them suffering. I mean, it's just a natural, very deeply ingrained instinct.
Do you mind if I jump in? But
Yeah.
on the other hand, obviously,
Well,
you know, we have a long human history in which we're generally compassionate and altruistic and cooperative with us, but pretty awful often to those who appear to be them, right? And then how do we balance those two? Yeah.
well, and I think this gets back to, in some ways, you're actually creating, if you will, actually this compassion cultivation training program that we have here at Stanford, and that's similar to some other programs where, number one, you have to be able to focus and settle the mind, but the other aspect is you have to understand your own, perhaps, harshness with yourself. And then the next is to, before you get there, you have to get a sense of what that deep caring is, which is this, for many people, it's thinking of a person who they love very deeply, their children. And then the next step is having that same feeling for yourself, and then expanding it to perhaps friends, and then the next step is a stranger, then the next step is someone who you have animosity towards. And it is this issue of expanding your in-group. And in fact, that's ultimately what's going to save humanity. But maybe you can comment, this is a leftover, again, from our Stone Age brain, right?
Yeah.
I think learning about brain science is not helpful for practice or therapy or spiritual life in a lot of ways. But there's certain findings, I have found at least, to be very, very useful. And that's the evolutionary neuropsychology bit, especially about how we evolved the social brain. And this is, I'm sure, territory you're really familiar with. But essentially, to simplify it, as we bred mainly within bands of around 50 or so people, competing very intensely with other bands for scarce resources at various points in our evolutionary history when our ancestors or early humans were an endangered species by the US government's standards. There are less than 15,000 of them on the planet altogether, maybe even less than 10,000. At those various points, like our genetic diversity as a human species is much less than the genetic diversity of chimpanzees because they didn't go through those bottlenecks of evolution that we did. So during these times, a survival strategy was to be very cooperative with us and to be very afraid of and careful about and willing to just annihilate them, right? So this is very innate in us, and there's a lot of research on how quickly we tend to categorize in-group, out-group. And as soon as you do it, then all kinds of things start to follow, such as literally in MRI scans, the impulse to help is slower when you see pictures of out-group members, no matter what your group is, white, black, male, female, gay, straight, whatever, the other, you're less inclined to help them quickly. So for me, what you're getting at is I would say half of what's profoundly important, you know, not to take away from it. In other words, how do we expand this categorical process that's occurring continually to regard the whole wide world as us in some sense? We might, just like in families, you quarrel, but you disagree with each other maybe, but it's us. You know, how do we have a world that's us? And that interests me enormously, how to help people do that. But that then goes to me, the other half of it, which is, again, it's kind of a respect for our frailty and, in a way, our biological nature, you know. In that, we're profoundly vulnerable to feeling that our core needs are not being met. And I think of this, my little model for it is that we have three core needs, you know, the avoiding harm system, the approaching reward system, and the attaching to others system. And that's a model that other people have used as well, sometimes with different terminology. Three core needs for safety, satisfaction, and connection, to simplify. And there's some things outside that frame, but there's a lot in that frame. Well, if your experience is that your core need for safety is not met in this moment, or your core need for enough resources coming into you is not being met in this moment, or for connection is not being met in this moment, what are you going to do? Your brain is trained to go into, I call it the reactive mode, kind of the red zone, where you will do whatever it takes, fight, flight, freeze, you know, appease, do whatever you need to do to live to see the sunrise and pass on your genes. That's what we're designed to do. So the question then becomes for me, how do you, with a brain that evolved to crave and suffer in order to survive, how do you help it experience that its core needs are met so that it's not so activated around basic survival, right? How do you internalize 10,000 times over, 10, 20 seconds at a time, powerful experiences of feeling fundamentally safe, fundamentally satisfied, and fundamentally connected, so increasingly you can operate in life not on the basis of craving, not on the basis of, in traditional words, hatred, greed, or heartache, you know, or you could say aversion, grasping, or clinging, under the general umbrella of craving. That interests me a lot because I think that as we help people repeatedly internalize that core experience of needs fundamentally met, not perfect, but fundamentally met, so they can tip out of that red zone, they can come into the resting state of the brain when it experiences its needs met, and then they can go forward into life on that basis. And on that basis then, they're much less inclined to see others as a threat. You know, and they're much less inclined also to give others cause to fear them.
Well, let me ask you a question on that point. We see people, in the United States as an example, we see this ever-expanding gap between the rich and the poor. Yet, theoretically, or nominally, the rich have essentially every need met, yet they're not sharing, and in fact, they're acquiring more. And it's a driver for many of them. And in fact, I'm sure you know this, I mean, their ability to even read these expressions of people who are suffering are diminished because they don't have to react to that because they're not in that position. How do you address that, let's say in that context? And this is not to be critical of that group of people. You know, from my own experience, if you grow up in poverty, there's often this tendency to have some anger or hostility at those who have when you don't.
Yeah.
And it's not, but in fact, that's really not an expression of it. It's just, it's unfortunate, but, there's a tendency to say, well, I'm suffering more than them. But in fact, once you've been in the world, you realize that there's great suffering there. It's just a different type of suffering.
Yeah.
But, how would you address that?
Yeah. So I grew up in LA, and I lived in the smog belt, the armpit of America. But anyway, it was pretty bad.
Is that the San Fernando?
No, it was West Covina.
I don't.
A lot of nice people live there. But anyway, my point is that obviously a lot of wealthy people are unhappy people. If we think of income inequality within America, okay, but then think about Americans as an aggregate compared to a third at least, if not 2/3 of the world's population. So there's a major difference there. And there's a lot of unhappiness here. And so clearly it's about experiencing that your core need is met, that you're fundamentally all right now, there's an enoughness, a fullness in this moment. You don't need to grasp and be driven for more, and that you're fundamentally loved enough. You're liked and loved enough. And enough people have bought your books already. You know what I mean? Whatever that is.
In fact, one I would recommend is
Yeah. And so my point is, it's not about the material supplies. Like right now I'm reading, for fun, Bleak House by Dickens, awesome book. And it's amazing, it's clear that 150 years ago, the material conditions were not available. In the time of the Buddha, the material conditions were not available to truly take care of these fundamental three needs for every person, every child, every old person, every person on the planet. But for a generation, roughly, if not arguably 2 generations, the material resources and the technological know-how have been present to fundamentally take care of the core needs of 7 billion people. But we haven't done it. And you can even see in the lives of people who are quite well-to-do, they too are caught up in anxiety and fear, drivenness and grasping, and a sense of loneliness or envy or comparing. They don't feel loved enough, etc. So it's not about your material circumstances.
No,
it's about what you internalize again and again inside.
Well, this is this idea, I think, if we go to Tibetan cosmology, this idea of the hungry ghost.
Yeah, that's right. That's LA. Welcome to the land of the hungry ghosts. But not to take away from the material impact of income inequality and all the rest of that, but to appreciate that. In addition to that, we have to help it land that we're okay. But I think actually, if you help it land that you're okay, you're not going to be so driven. Like I've known a number of people who are very wealthy, and some of them have good hearts, and they write big checks for projects like yours. And
oh, could you introduce
You have
me?
a big heart too, and you've written subjects.
I've written
I
a
have
few.
to know
Right?
from
Yes.
your
Thank you.
bio.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
and I've known a fair number of lower income people who are kind of nasty and cranky. So it's not just about wealth that's the determinant. But I guess the point I'm just trying to make is that it's not enough to take care of your material needs. I'm all for that. But at the end of the day, if you don't register that your fundamental underlying drives are met, you're still going to be a cranky person.
Well, maybe part of that, I think, has to do to issues related to attachment, right?
You mean childhood attachment?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
What do you think?
You mean in terms of how people are raised, whether they're secure or insecure?
Exactly. I mean, if you don't have a sense of that you are cared for,
Yeah,
or
that's right.
yeah,
That's very cool that you're going there with that. That's very interesting. I've never heard anyone do that, to link craving broadly defined to insecure attachment beyond interpersonal attachment. That's great.
No, I think it's, I mean, my own experience in those situations is that, if the thing, if you will, that fundamentally feeds you as a human being is not present as you're growing up, you always have a hunger, right?
Right. That's right. Yeah, the hungry heart. Or I called it the hole in my heart, which I then started filling when I finally got, to college and beyond. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, the analogy I have used in the past is this concept of wounds of the heart, where all of us have them, and for most of us, they heal quickly, and we grow and develop. But that being said, there's some that are profoundly deep and painful and continue to cause pain, and until those issues are resolved, the outward actions of an individual are often extraordinarily negative. This is this idea that sometimes we look at poverty, we look at war, we look at ecological destruction as these existential issues,
Yeah.
but they're actually us.
Right.
And I think getting back to how do I solve this other half of the problem, I mean,
Yeah.
it's basically how do you fix those wounds so that someone understands that they have the potential to be loved and cared for. And,
Yeah. Well, if I could say this, so if you think about it, as we evolved, there really wasn't the material basis for it being safe to rest in an ongoing state all the time pretty much of experiencing that your core needs were met. And that was a bad strategy to pass on genes, because if you're all Zen, back in the Serengeti, you're chunked. So for the human species now, in a way that's completely unprecedented in our tenure on the planet, to actually have the material basis to take care of the fundamental needs, for safety, enough food and satisfaction, and also connection for people, is to me an extraordinary and completely unprecedented opportunity. And I think how the human species as a whole grapples with this possibility. It is possible. And therefore, if we're not manifesting it, we are constructing its alternative ourselves. And we only have ourselves to look to. And I think the knowledge of that will bleed out increasingly. And I think it's part of what's driving some of the reaction to wealth inequality worldwide. There's a growing sense of, it doesn't have to be this way. You people can still have really nice cars and a refrigerator full of stuff, and you don't have to be impoverishing us and immiserating us on a daily basis so you can have one more SUV in your garage, So I think that is an historical moment here to realize that we're in a very new time as a species.
I think, though, one of the issues which you alluded to, though, is this idea, though, that when you don't have the time, like I'll give you an example. I see a lot of people with low back pain, and by the nature of my job. And frankly, a lot of it doesn't have to do with the pathology you see on the x-ray. It is a manifestation of other types of pain that is being manifested in their low back. But they have time to focus on that or place that. And I tell people sometimes, which actually sometimes they get it and sometimes they really get irritated with me, as I say, you don't see low back pain in Afghanistan, in the sense that you don't have time to think about low back pain. It is a luxury to think about, geez, my needs aren't being met today, when you're struggling to meet your most basic needs. That being said, you also look in these third world countries as an example where people have really the basic needs met. They have food, they have security, they have a roof over their heads. These are some of the most fundamentally, deeply happy, fulfilled people. And yet they're still working very hard. They still, compared to our standards on the West, have extraordinarily little. But why are they so happy? And sometimes this having more time, greater time to have introspection, having more, ends up fundamentally being less at the end of the day, I think.
Yeah, a couple of things there. So first off, I just think a lot about, in a way, wasted opportunities to take positive moments and actually help them sink in, stick to your ribs, get some benefit from this little 30-second opportunity here. And I also think about how we actually have it within our power. Speaking of children who are insecurely attached, anxious or avoidant, etc. We actually have it in our power, whether that's our issue, and I had issues in that area, or other issues. It's in our power in an imperfect world to repeatedly turn into positive experiences, particularly ones that are our own personal medicine, that are our vitamin C. We have scurvy and we need C, we don't need iron, right? To turn into those moments or to create them or look for them. And then when they happen, bring a big spoon out of kindness and compassion for yourself, not out of craving for pleasant experiences. And my own hope about that is that that will both help people in terms of healing from their pain or their past. It'll also support everyday well-being. It supports spiritual practice. And my utopian vision, and I have not given up on the 60s, of the world coming to a softer landing that it's headed for, is if we can get a critical mass of brains worldwide, 10 million, a billion, I think it's probably around the tipping point, right about there.
15% is
That rest, okay, that's great. That would rest most minutes of most days in the responsive mode of the brain, where you feel like your basic needs are met while you're still engaging in life, et cetera. I think that would really tend to help the world, end up in a softer landing.
Yeah, it's interesting when they talk about adoption rates and the tipping point, whatever it is, it's always 15%. It's the other interesting thing when you mention this issue of sort of grabbing as much as you can when you need it, is this reality, I think, that people who have a attachment issue, or as you mentioned, you had yourself perhaps, or I can tell you I had, where you've had things that you either wanted or caused pain that you didn't have. The challenge, I think, for many people is that, unfortunately, when you get stressed or when you are scared or concerned or whatever, you fall back on that same fear.
Yeah.
And start reliving those, and then perhaps the negative behaviors you've used will kick in, and it's very hard sometimes. I'm not talking about myself, of course, so I don't want to. No, I think. So you were. So what is your grand strategy here to make this happen? Because you mentioned that you had a vision. How would you do that?
Well, two parts. So first off, to not be so reflexively reactivated by things ranging from can't find a parking place, right?
I was so pissed earlier. No.
I heard about that, right? Or a frown across the dinner table, or someone giving you the eye roll, like,
I just fired them.
Okay, well, there you go. But anyway, one way into that, of course, is to resource yourself, is to gradually build up resources inside. When you feel like you're running on empty, and your experience, that's what's so interesting about these people in poorer countries. They don't experience running on empty, even though they hardly own a single thing at all. But that's not their experience, whereas we all these hungry ghosts, whether it's in LA or the country club here or there or wherever, who they experience kind of running on empty, and they're always looking for the next thing. So, but if you can repeatedly resource yourself, I call it the 10,000 moments, 10 seconds at a time. But we can actually do that. Then you can build up and become a lot less reactive, and in my own case, become securely attached, with enough practice over time. Well, about how do you help the planet go green? I don't mean that in this case ecologically, which of course I'm a fan of, but neurologically, neuropsychologically. How do you, if you could, like at Google, you go there, you see these images of searches worldwide. That's kind of cool, like pillars of light bouncing up and down. If we could get color coding on the 7 billion brains on the planet, and have a large swath of them, a tipping point, if you will, green, how to do that. I do think that people having the will, how many therapists it takes to change a light bulb, right? One, only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. That's the other thing, right? So how do you get a critical mass of 1 billion brains? How do you get 1 billion brains wanting to rest in a state where, you can probably tell I'm operationalizing Buddhism in a neurological frame, where there's very little of the underlying biological basis for the craving that leads to suffering and harm. How would you actually do that? And I think if people have the will for it, it really begins with registering again and again and again, penetrating through Mother Nature's well-intended lies that are continually whispering, be afraid, right? Be hungry, there's not enough. Or sell more books, be more popular, whatever, right? Get more stars on Hollywood Boulevard, whatever your thing is. I think if people realize that's a key part of it. It's not all of it. Obviously, we have to stop dumping carbon into the atmosphere, obviously.
Well, but that leads to the other, right?
Yeah, they go together. So my hope is that people increasingly realize that they have the power within themselves to gradually change their own brain for the better.
But, one of the challenges here is actually if you look at Tibetan Buddhism, it's not a scalable, right? Because you have a Lama who has the students and, 1, 2 who go through 15 or 20 years. How do you scale up such a change? And I think that's the challenge.
So what I mean with that build-up, wind up, pitch, batted baseball over here. Anyway, having, again, I'm sure people in the room have had, you as well, quite profound experiences of one kind or another, right? And Jack Kornfield's book, After the Ecstasy, Then the Laundry, right? And so I think it's easy to underestimate the many moments in everyday life when the brain is set on green, where we're basically relaxed, there's no agitation, we're not disturbed. We're in our homeostatic resting state, where we go when we experience our needs are met. And we tend to underestimate those moments. We kind of blur right by them because they're often not very dramatic. Often also many moments when there's little sense of self. Self is very strongly activated when we're in a fear or flight or interpersonal conflict kind of situation. So we have those moments. They're kind of modest, you know? They're oatmeal moments, but they're great moments. And I think if we appreciate more of them and we value them and we take the extra little 5-10 seconds to sort of let them land, increasingly that becomes our resting state. And then we practice from there. It's not the ultimate awakening. You need to bring, I think, virtue and morality in, as well as a lot of activation of the heart. These are really important elements. Insight, too. But it's a great neuropsychological foundation for profound practice, let alone, you know, getting through a day happy, basically.
I'll share with you an idea that I'm working on, and you can comment. I'm organizing a World Compassion Festival for 2015. Now, it's not meant to be the there as simply a festival, but the goal is to bring youth to service to understand the power of volunteerism and caring for others, and it's not only youth, but everyone, but primarily youth, focused on those problems that are greatest facing our humanity. And then on top of that, actually to have this is a 3 or 4 day event, to have musical activists, if you will, because we know music is very inspiring. And then on top of this, to have individuals who transcend religion and transcend culture, such as His Holiness, Desmond Tutu, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, perhaps in some places, even Muhammad Ali. And but simultaneously, because the goal here is to create a meme of compassion throughout the world. So there's something called the Compassionate Cities program, where what happens is, and there are only a handful, but this is based on Karen Armstrong's Charter of Compassion, which is you bring the city government, the businesses, the religious organizations, volunteer organizations, the community, the schools, together to create an ethos of compassion for the city,
Right.
or for those within the city, and also as a safety net for its most vulnerable members. And then the goal is to have 100 compassionate cities by 2015, and then broadcast this, and then that potentially could reach that.
Tipping point.
Exactly.
We're talking
And
about.
so this is,
Good for you.
well, it's a small little project that I'm working on right now. But His Holiness is engaged, Sri Sri, Desmond Tutu, Muhammad Ali, and a variety of other people. So we'll see if we can, and Karen Armstrong, we'll see if we can pull it off. But that's just a side project that we're doing here.
That's great, really great. You know, if I could build on what you said there, because as soon as you started talking about it, I began thinking about fear and how, as you say, there is this longing in the heart to love, right? And we're designed to love, and love is one of the great stress relief and analgesics around, right? If Merck could patent love, we'd see ads for love every night on TV, right?
Somebody would patent it and then claim they own it, right?
Yeah. From the standpoint of, you know, its health benefits. But anyway, on the other hand, what blocks this compassion or quality, I think a lot for people, is they experience being unsafe. They feel afraid. And more broadly, they're afraid of being threatened, they're afraid of not getting enough, and they're afraid of not being loved. So in that sense, there's this kind of primal fear. And one of the things that's been important for me in my own practice personally, as well as with people, is to not underestimate the power of the dark side of the force, you know, the fear factor, and to really appreciate how important it is to help others dial down their fear. I think a lot about not constituting a threat for others. You know, the Buddhist phrase is, give no person cause to fear you. You might give them cause to expect that they won't have a job if they don't come to work on time. Okay, but that's different from going to war with them. And so I think respecting the power of fear, our vulnerability to fear, the fact that we were prey animals long before we were predators of any significance, is important, I think, for us to really appreciate. And then I think a lot about how to help undo the ongoing whisper of anxiety. Even if you rationally know you're kind of okay, walk across the campus without one molecule of anxiety in your mind for more than a few seconds in a row. It's actually not that easy to do if you're particularly aware of yourself.
This is, false evidence appearing as real? Is that what? Fear,
yeah.
right?
Oh, there you are. That's the acronym,
Yeah.
FEAR. Yeah,
Right.
exactly right. So to me, that's another one. Again, I think income inequality and other things tend to drive fear, and then fear drives income inequality in a vicious cycle. But to have, for me, when there was the threat level orange thing flashing all the time in airports, for me it was an act of kind of civil and cultural disobedience to walk through airports refusing to be afraid. I used to be a risk analyst for a mathematician for a year, one of the cooler jobs I had in my 20s. And the actual risk of a bad event on my flight today is like threat level chartreuse. It's a swimming pool of green paint with a drop of yellow.
Right.
That's it. That's the actual risk on my flight that day. And so to move through and just refuse to be afraid, So I think that's another thing to think about as a basis, a factor of compassion.
But as you know, I mean, the problem with humans is we are not made to do risk analysis, right? That is the problem. We are horrible at determining risk, and that's part of the problem with fear.
Yeah, that's right. We tend to overestimate. I call it paper tiger paranoia. We tend to overestimate the chance of a bad event in some ways, and underestimate it.
Right.
Of course, in
Well, and I think that human nature is displayed every time there is a bad event, whether it's unfortunately this situation in Boston, which is just horrible. But every time an event has happened at an airport, for a year, you can't park a car, you can't do this, you have this incredible presence. Yet the reality is that within a year, everything's back pretty close to the way it was. And I don't think there's much evidence that's shown that all of this stuff has decreased anything.
That's right. They talk about security theater. Well, as you know, as a surgeon, right, it's really important to recognize the real tigers. That I think myself as a guy who's done a lot of rock climbing, within an inch, I know that cliff. For you, within a millimeter or probably less, the margins you're working with. And it's really important to see clearly. I mean, ignorance is the ultimate root of suffering and harm, if you will. On the other hand, I just think it's helpful to appreciate at a personal level how much we ourselves are vulnerable to making misjudgments and miscalculations based on anxiety for which there's no basis. There's a term in psychology, signal anxiety, but most of the internal origin, if you will, of anxiety is a false alarm. It's noise. It's not signal. And in fact, it makes it harder to see the real threats, like the planet's warming up.
No, I think that's right. Maybe what we can do is, I'm sure it sounds like we'll go on continuing on this, but maybe we should ask some questions or have people, or maybe we can ask you guys questions. Have you ever done that? Where we ask the audience questions.
I'll tell you a question, if I can jump in, and I think about, which is, what is the one thing that if a critical mass of humans did worldwide for 5 minutes every day, that would save the world? I don't have the right answer to that question.
Not flush the toilet.
But what is that one thing, And I think that's just a powerful question even to ask, right? And to put it out there to have people consider it.
Right. Yes, sir.
So, talked a lot about the individual, but about 30% of what you're really focused on is group action. And so I'm sort of curious to hear what it would feel like, and you speculate a little about this, to not glamorize poverty, which I think is a luxury for us to do, but to talk about what happens when we are 10,000 people and motivated to survive together through some practices, and then scale that up to the number that we are. So, if the wiring was there in such a fashion, what could be replicated now with all of our technologies to make it work better?
So obviously it's a profoundly important question, and I think there are levels of intervention, right? You could intervene in terms of the macro ecology of the entire planet, or in the economy, the banking system, or arms control, or physical health, right? And then you could bring it all the way down to the level of an individual mind. So I think all levels of intervention are important. People often privilege their personal one over others, but I think they're all important. My own focus is at the level of the individual, one mind at a time, one brain at a time, if you will. So that's more where my expertise is. But that said, when I think about how do you scale up, from a practical standpoint, I'll just name for me some major go-tos, and then I talk about them and I try to live them too. One is to really get on your own side, because if you're not initially on your own side, you're not going to do anything at all. That's really incredibly important. And for some people, that goes without saying. For other people, that's a dead stop. They're not there yet. Second is to really address the power of fear and the power of negative learning. Do not underestimate its power, and take up arms against your oppressors, most of which live inside your head. That's a really important thing. Then you move out to scaling, this us-them dichotomy. How do you expand the circle of us, to include others? It's very hard to include that, to expand that circle when you feel like your own basic needs are not met. You have to experience that your needs are met, then it's a lot easier to be altruistic, benevolent, and so forth. So that's where, for me, practices of internalizing felt experiences, 5, 10 seconds, 20 seconds at a time of needs met, really important. And materially, do what you can to get fresh water for yourself, or a lock on your front door, or et cetera, a better job. And so, okay, fine. And then to go further, what are the things that are well known, and Jim knows more than I do about this, that are well known to kind of prompt compassion for other people, right, and caring? One is to see them as children. We're very moved to help children. Even children of out groups, we're very helped. So one thing that I'll do, particularly if someone's, aggravating me, let's say, I'll try to see them as a kid. And sometimes I have to go very young. I won't talk about recent vice presidents that I really had to go very young with. But anyway, when you finally see them really, really, really young, at some point, your heart kind of melts and softens. That's very powerful in us. Another thing is to look for common qualities, because then if you can find those us's that join us together, even if you're a different religion, different gender, different language group, what have you, then we're more inclined to help those other people. And then the last thing, again from a lot of research, is direct contact, direct exchanges of one kind or another. That's where I'm an uber fan of technology for this sort of stuff. I was just in Haiti, which, talk about a devastating place. It just blew my mind, honestly. I'd never been in that kind of a situation before. You see very poor people, trying to sell used shoes on the street. They have their cell phone. And I love that as well in terms of concentrations of power, that there's more and more technology. We're not out of the woods yet, for sure, but individual citizens can just turn their camera on and chukung, they're watching the police shoot demonstrators, and boom, it's on Reuters 2 minutes later out of Egypt, for example. So those are some preliminary thoughts. My last one, and I speak as a total amateur in this topic, it obviously, as many have pointed out, educate girls, especially in third world countries. And then relating to my first book, about mothers, take really good care of mothers. I'm a fan of dads, I'm a dad, I'm a guy, blah, blah. But man, if we want to change this world in one generation, massively support mothers.
Your first question was, you threw it out to the audience, what would you do to change the world?
Yeah.
And it's not a program. I mean, it could be developed into a program. It could be a piece of technology, but it really starts, I think, with the responsibility of me and you. How am I feeling about myself? How do I choose to feel about myself? Mm-hmm. And maybe a simple practice of, today I'm going to do 2 hard things, and that's probably saying hi to people I don't normally say hi to,
mm-hmm.
or give a compliment to someone I normally don't say compliments to.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot of energy. I mean, I'm just thinking, I don't know if I could do it, but maybe I can. I think I'm getting better at it.
Yeah.
So, it's not necessarily a program, a program could be developed, but it's how do we teach that? How do we experience that? How do you perhaps enlighten someone with that? And So it's that one-on-one sharing, perhaps. And I got a question for you guys. So I hear, our brain, we're only using, 5, 10, 15% of the gray matter? What is the other stuff about? What's going
It's
on?
dark matter, and we don't know what the heck's going on there. That statement has been said, but it's not quite as simple as that. You can have certain types of brain injuries that on a very superficial level appear not to have caused a significant deficit, but when you do very sophisticated psychometric testing, there's some significant problems. So I'm not sure if that's really a correct statement in this world. To get back to your other statement, oftentimes people think of suffering as, geez, there's so much suffering, I'm overwhelmed, what can I do, I'm just so-and-so. But everyone is suffering. And when you really think about your own pain, and I'm sure everyone in this room on some level has a certain type of pain that they deal with, if you just spend a little time thinking about the things that make you feel hurt or scared or afraid, and then look at somebody else and realize that they're probably feeling the exact same way. And we, each of us, have a capacity every day to interact with somebody, like you were saying, and it's really simple. Sometimes it's just saying hello to somebody who looks sad. Sometimes it's, if you will, paying forward something to give somebody a surprise that they didn't expect. And when you do that yourself, Adam Grant, I don't know if you've read his work. He's a professor at the Wharton School, a very accomplished young man. He talks about this idea of giving and the power of it and how it comes back to you. And in fact, he's made it his ethos to act this way. And it's really true. In my own limited experience, at least I try. I'm not always successful, but I really try to be available and to respond. And when people send me emails and be there. And again, it's very powerful because people reach out to you then. Now, is it 100%? No. Are there some people who take advantage? Absolutely. But in the big scope of the world, or your world that you interact in, you'll find that it's very powerful. It makes you feel good. It's interesting. Excuse me. There's some studies on volunteerism, and these are in people over the age of 65. And in some ways, volunteerism is helping others, right? If a person volunteers a certain minimum number of hours, they get this immense benefit that ultimately translates into a dramatic increase in longevity. But when they survey these people, it only works if you are authentic and sincere about it, meaning that you are doing it unconditionally without other motive. If the people who sit there and say, well, I'm doing this to impress my friends, if I'm doing this because my name's going to go up there, and that's the primary driver, you don't get any of the benefit of that. So it has to be an authentic desire to care and to connect and to be there for someone. And I think that's the important thing.
I wanted to just briefly build on that quickly. So on the brain 10% thing, I think it's actually because roughly 90% of the brain is so-called white matter. The other is gray matter, which is the neuronal bodies. But Mother Nature would not build a brain that, even though it weighs 2 to 3% of body weight, uses 20 to 25% of the oxygen and glucose in our blood if we didn't need every little bit of it. So, and they're actually finding increasingly that the so-called white matter of the brain, including the glial cells, are performing information processing functions, not just supporting the neurons. So that's point one. Point two, we all have our growing edge. Whether it's saying hello to someone on campus, or stepping outside of your house in the first place, right? Or sitting in front of 30, 50 or more people. Whatever the growing edge is. And I think about part out of respecting ourselves and having compassion for ourselves and what it takes to move into our growing edge, and out of the wisdom that if we want to motivate ourselves to keep moving into our growing edge, it's important to appreciate that whatever that edge for you is heroic ground. It's honorable ground. You honor yourself by moving in it. Doesn't mean you get a halo, doesn't mean you get an Emmy or a Nobel Prize, right? Or your name on the plaque at CCARE. But it means that day, that issue, you sucked it up and you went for it and you did something kind of hard and scary, and it's honorable and you deserve to feel good about that. And then you let that register, and that then empowers you and fuels you to do that again the next day. And I think that's very important. The last thing I would just say about the volunteerism thing, it's also okay to know, though, in the back of the mind that, to your question of how to motivate people, that being good is good, right? Bertrand Russell has this quote, he says, as I see it, happy people are good people. Not because being good will make you happy, but because being happy will make you good. In other words, when you're happy yourself, you get gooder toward others, and you have all kinds of physical health benefits. So knowing that in the back of your mind then can help motivate you to move into benevolence, and that's okay. You still get the benefit in the studies that you were talking about. Okay, great. Others? Thanks.
First of all, thank you very much. I think this has been a great session. And one of the things I'd love to continue to explore is sort of the ideas that you guys are talking about here. I'm going to pick up your book, Buddha's Brain. Are there other sort of thought leaders out there that you would recommend for me or any of us, I guess, as we're sort of exploring this idea more? Are there people who are doing research, who are publishing, writing books that are accessible to the layperson, not necessarily the scientist? I'd love to learn.
More neural related or more love related or heart compassion related or both? Or?
All three?
Actually, why don't we do this? What we will do, now that you mentioned, I think it's an excellent idea, and I appreciate it, is we will actually put a thing on our website that lists, there's probably about 50 books, well, I'm sure there are many more than 50, but there are really some great books that go over the neuroscience for laymen. There are books that go over, having a tender heart, if you will, from perhaps a Buddhist perspective, or even other tradition perspectives that. And again, you can pick and choose, and maybe what we'll do is we'll have the book and put a little thing on it so that you'll have access to that. And, on my own Kindle, I have about 90 books. About 40 or 50 of them are the ones that I try to read or have read about a lot of these things.
To build on what you said, though, about music, he introduced that notion twice so far, so there you are. Singing, gospel, things like that. You might even want to post song clips that are very moving, or YouTube clips. You may have seen this one on gratitude with, oh boy, I'm forgetting his name. What's the name of the monk who is the gratitude? Whatever. Yeah, Stendhal, Father Stendhal Rost. Yeah, that's amazing. I'll tell you another one is Mr. Rogers accepting a Lifetime Emmy Award. Bring the box. It's about a 3-minute clip. I'm getting teary just remembering it. It is so moving. And he goes into Hollywood. He goes into the belly of the beast, the land of the hungry ghosts, and he just stops them in their tracks for 10 seconds. So, there are a lot of ways to be moved.
Yeah, no, and there's some really, it's interesting, and maybe we should try posting them because now people from all over send me these clips all the time, and they're like that every time. I go, oh, geez, I can't do it.
And you're easy.
Well, my wife will say at Lassie movie I start crying. So
it's dog food commercials when my wife knew she was pregnant. That was the kipper right there. Go on.
Let me actually tell you something though that I find has been useful for myself, and is I go through a mantra every morning, which is part of the alphabet. I think I may have mentioned it sometimes to people. And I'll tell you a story that came from that. So I gave a talk at my medical school to the incoming medical students. I was asked to come, and they were kind enough to ask me. And the medical students, they have something called a white coat ceremony. So they put on their white coat, they take the oath of Hippocrates or some oath, and then theoretically there's an inspirational type of speaker. He couldn't show up, so they asked me to. No, but one of the things I talked about for that, and as a practice I have myself, is I said, there are these mnemonics we use to remember things in medical school, but a mnemonic I use to help me throughout the day that starts my day is I actually go through this part of the alphabet, which is CDFGHIJKL, and it's compassion. And I actually consciously go through this every day. It's compassion, and first for myself, and then for others. It's respecting the dignity, D, for every person. It's equanimity, because our lives are going to have ups and downs, and it's understanding that it's sort of the long haul, and if you attach yourself too much to the ups, you're going to be disappointed, and if you attach yourself to the downs, it's really unrealistic. F is forgiveness. All of us fail other people, and we fail ourselves sometimes, and people fail us, and that's the nature of life. But when you hang on to anger and hostility towards individuals who you feel have wronged you, it's just very painful and it's a poison for yourself and it doesn't go anywhere. So thinking of actually all the people to forgive who you think may have slighted you, or even yourself if you've unconsciously done that. Gee, is gratitude. So many people, and this begs the question, so many people are looking up saying what they don't have. The reality is, us being in this room, we're better off than 99% of the people. It's to look down and be thankful and blessed and have gratitude. And H is humility. And I can tell you for a neurosurgeon, that's the hardest thing. But humility, understanding that, so many people, you're in a conversation with them, to really have compassion and care for another, it's not looking down. It's looking eye to eye. As soon as you look eye to eye, then that means you're connected and you're at the same level and you're just a human being. There is no up or down. And I is integrity of spirit of who you are and what your values are. J is an idea and a concept of social justice. And K is actually the act of compassion, which is kindness. And at the end of it, which holds it all together, is love. It's interesting. A woman sent me a letter because I gave this talk one time. And what she had done was she actually made a set of beads that have 10 beads on it. And it's this little thing. And she actually has a card that goes with it. And it's a little thing that now she sent me one of these. Or she asked me permission if she could do this, but she sent me one of these. And it's really wonderful. I go through my little things, and it's a nice little thing that you can carry around in your pocket. So she actually just sent me 100. So if you guys let me know. But that works for me.
Much of what you talked about today reflect Buddhist concepts, and I feel like for a long time there have been a lot of efforts in academic circles to strip the Buddhism out of the Buddhist concepts, which I think, I'm a therapist and somewhat practicing Buddhist. I think those concepts are critical for actually people doing them long term. Compassion's a great idea, we think about it, but if you think about why you want to be compassionate, maybe the concept of karma will help you to continue to be compassionate, etc. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, so, well, first, karma. I remember this fellow, speaking of the human potential days early in the 60s or mid-60s in San Francisco, Stephen Gaskin. His definition of karma is hitting golf balls in a tiled shower, all right? Comes back really quickly, for better or worse, whether there's a future life or not, but inside the naturalist frame, even in this life, just hitting those golf balls has immediate consequences. And we can hit good golf balls. We could do practices like that, extremely touching, series of alphabet letters. So that would be my first point. Second point, I think it is true that as Buddhism is probably the leading contemplative tradition in terms of its impact socially, culturally, for a variety of reasons, including His Holiness, being very connected to scientists here, and science is the secular religion of the West, right? I think sometimes if you want to sell used cars successfully, put on a white lab coat and drape a stethoscope around your neck, and then you can just talk about carburetors, but you're going to sell more cars, right, over the course of the day. So as that's happened, I think some things have happened, and one of them that has struck me a fair amount is a misunderstanding about mindfulness itself. In that, if you think about it, there are three ways to engage the mind, right? We can just witness it, leave it alone, we witness it, hopefully with some kindness toward ourselves. Or we can get in there and reduce negatives, or we can get in there and grow positives. That's it. Or we could transcend the mind entirely, but that's outside the naturalist frame. Okay, inside this frame, you just have three choices. And it's important to be mindful in all three. Mindfulness is simply sustained presence of mind, recollectedness, in the root of the word in early Buddhism. And you can be recollected whether you're just witnessing the stream of consciousness, or reducing the negative, pulling weeds in the garden of the mind, or increasing the positive, planting flowers. And I've had people who resist the notion of wise effort, of one of the elements of the Eightfold Path, of actually intervening, whether it's in therapy or conversation with a friend, or doing a little practice like you're describing on a regular basis. Whoa, that's not mindfulness. Well, wait a second, you're being profoundly mindful and teary when you just talk about it, obviously. And a person can be mindful there too. So I think that's a very important point, just about mindfulness in general. But you're right as well. Other people comment that if you deconstruct Buddhism, although the Buddha was a pre-modern postmodernist, because the whole analysis in Buddhism is radically phenomenological. He just deconstructs experience categorically, irrespective of content. And then you start realizing your experience directly is incredibly insubstantial and foamy and transient and evanescent, and the neural substrates of it, these little coalitions of tens of millions, if not billions, of synapses that are coming together to form a sound, a sight, a thought, a feeling, are decaying under your feet, even as you try to make sense of what that sound was, right? So if you chase after any of that, it's a sure prescription for suffering. That's his analysis. That's a completely phenomenological, materialist analysis. There's no transcendental and supernatural involved in that analysis. So anyway, very deconstructive. So when you culturally deconstruct elements out of Buddhism traditionally and just extract mindfulness, and then make it a thing, even if you have to change the name of it because it sounds too Buddhist, so you call it reflection, moments of reflection in grade schools around the country, whatever. End of the day, whatever bottle you put it in, it's the good wine, so, it's okay. My point is that there is a problem sometimes when you extract things from their cultural context. On the other hand, if it's useful, it's useful, If it helps people be less stressed out to do a little contemplative practice, or honestly, and there are interesting implications of this, to be one bit less stressed by being in combat, by having some kind of mindfulness practice, and be 1 degree more resilient and not so likely to suffer from PTSD. Okay. On the other hand, as you point out, if you leave out the moral dimensions as well as the insight dimensions, then you just have one of the elements of the practice and not the whole practice.
I think you have to be careful because there are a lot of people who are sensitive to this idea that you're pushing Buddhism versus, as was pointed out, thousands of years of thought, deep thought into this deconstruction is why it's so valuable, and it is one of the areas of these types of introspections that has been deconstructed so that it can be analyzed deeply by neuroscientists. If you look at other traditions, it's a much more complicated thing. And I think it's absolutely correct. As an example, sometimes people pull out mindfulness, but without wisdom and compassion, it can become sort of a self-absorbing, narcissistic endeavor that's not particularly helpful. So, nothing happens in a vacuum. I think we have to acknowledge perhaps where some of these things are from. But that being said, when you're looking at a secular world and trying to put some of these very helpful practices in that have been empirically tested, typically you do pull out the components that you would associate with Buddhism because, number one, they're not going to be accepted. And, in different parts of the country, there are different vocal groups who have very strong opinions because they think there's some undercurrent of brainwashing going on. So I think that's really the challenge. One more question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I really appreciate this whole discourse, and it seems to focus on individual consciousness, individual change and growth. And I love that. Don't want to take anything away from it. At the same time, with this question of what can we each do for 5 minutes to change the world, I think, there are some limits to what we can do as individuals. And I'm curious about your insight about how we bridge from individual change in consciousness to the collective consciousness. You look at tribal warfare, global warming, huge systemic problems, where frankly you add up a zillion well-intended individuals and it's not going to be that 100th month. There's something bigger and different. And what do we have to say about that?
Well, that's an easy one. Why don't you answer? And that's our last question, I see.
Well, a couple things. So first off, I had a teacher who, whenever a tough question was lobbed out, which means therefore usually a really important question, right? She said, well, that's a koan. So in other words, that was the way to duck, right? Well, that's a koan, it's unanswerable. So I think part of what's helpful is to, and really just engage that as a question, and to sit with it and to sit with the difficulty of it. And, you can't have even a semblance of knowledge about history without being struck by the staggering history of cruelty to people. Watch Game of Thrones. Obviously, it's a fictional world, but it's really describing a kind of early medieval culture, well before any kind of really significant rule of law. And that was the lot in life of a lot of people. So, on the one hand, I think it's helpful to appreciate the challenge of it, is my point for myself. But then if I were to look at it more broadly, I think it's, and again, I'm a guy who's mostly focused on the level of the individual, right? And I really respect people who've thought deeply about new technologies that dump less carbon into the atmosphere, or I've gotten very involved in how do you bring rule of law into emerging countries, et cetera, or how do you improve the so-called rule of law in our own country, which is far from perfect. So I've thought about this mostly at the level of individuals, 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 at the level of individuals,